Now, as I said a short while ago in this lecture, we meet one of the inhabitants of the other world, the goddess Macha. She is the goddess intimately associated with the Navan complex, with Navan Fort in County Armagh, one of the royal sites that I've already mentioned. You remember from the introduction that Navan Fort is this great enclosure with the great mound within it and the other smaller circular enclosure, both of these sites excavated many years ago by Dudley Waterman between 1963 and 72 with exceptional results. And the large earthwork, as we saw already, encloses the summit of this drumlin ridge, and it has that configuration that we saw elsewhere: internal ditch and external bank. And the enclosure here, judging from some very limited excavation, seems to be more or less contemporary with Rhind, the great enclosure on the hill of Tara. Of course, and I've already mentioned this, Navan Fort, Eoghan Macha, figures in early Irish literature as a great royal settlement. It was the court of Concobar, king of Ulster. And it's described in the usual terms of extravagant splendor that we've come across already. And you can see here that in this particular account from the tale, The Wooing of Emer, you have once again an account of a great prosperous king, a successful sacred king living in a wonderful house with numerous compartments and so on and so forth. Like the description of the house of Alel and Mev at Rathcroghan at ancient Croghan, this is the same literary stereotype applied to any medieval royal residence. And as we've seen in these stories, and this was the case in that story about the birth of Cuchulainn, even in these accounts of, heroic activities, there are elements that take us to older and deeper mythic levels. And sacral kingship and the other world are very much part of the story of Eoghan Macha. The goddess Macha is worth looking at from one particular angle in particular. She figures prominently in the place lore, the prose Dinhanicus of Armagh, Macha, the great ecclesiastical centre nearby. And here there are different manifestations of the goddess. You've got Macha, who's allegedly the wife of Enemedd, one of the sort of earlier visitors to the island of Ireland. The second daughter is a red-haired Macha who is credited, as you can see, with basically creating the enclosure at Eoghan Macha. And the third Macha is said to be the wife of one Crund or Crunnock, and she is a Macha who raced against the king's horses in a famous tale, as we see in a moment. Now, it may seem strange to have no less than 3 separate manifestations of the one figure, but we should remember that variants like this in myth, they serve to complement rather than contradict one another and illustrate sort of different aspects of the divine figure. In linking, for example, one of these goddesses to the land of Macha, we're linking a female figure to a feminized land. Various writers have seen in these 3 Machas a reflection perhaps of, Dumézil's trifunctional ideology. But I think we can just gently sideskip the complications here of a triplet of Machas and simply focus on the third Macha, who is most interesting from, I suppose, an archaeological point of view. She gave her name to Eoghan Macha after racing against the horses of the king, Concobar, when she gave birth to twins, Evan. And her mythology is of a special interest. The fullest account of this third Macha occurs in another tale and particularly in the second recension of a tale called The Debility of the Ulsterman. And basically, it's a fairly long account of this particular myth. Part of it reads, "Whence the affliction of the Ullad? It is not difficult. Cronach Mac Ognaman of the Ullad was a hostler of 100 cows. He lived in the wilderness and mountains and had many sons. Moreover, his wife was dead. One day he was in his house on his own, and he saw a woman coming towards him in the house. The woman immediately began to prepare food, as if she were in the house she had always been in. When night came, she served the family without question. She slept with Cronach that night. She remained with them for a long time afterwards, and they lacked no produce, neither food nor clothing." There's more to this than a simple tale of a woman visiting a house. She appears as a supernatural being. She's the wife of a wealthy mortal of 100 cows, and it's very clear that her appearance and her union with this Cronach increased his wealth. He, however, was a boastful man, and at the assembly, or Éanach at Macha, boasted that his wife could run faster than the horses of the king. And in this he broke a pledge of silence and discretion that he had made to her. And his pregnant wife is forced to race, like a mare, against the horses of the king. And this part goes, she raced against the chariot, and then when the chariot reached the end of the green, her childbirth began in front of it, so that she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. It is from this that Macha is named. She cried out in her childbirth, and anyone who heard her fell ill for 5 days and 4 nights. That pain used to come perpetually to every Ulsterman who was there. For 9 generations of each man who was there, that was the affliction of the Ullad. Basically, she gave birth to twins and cursed the Ulsterman, who for 9 generations must suffer the same debility of childbirth as she. Some people thought it was a sort of cuvad of some description. But it's a weakness that meant only Cuchulainn, who was not Ulster born, could defend Ulster when Meath and the men of Connaught attacked, as recounted in the Táin. So on one level here we have a tale that gives an explanation for the name of Macha. But there are multiple layers of meaning here, and the equine horsey associations are immensely important. All of the manifestations of Macha are basically goddesses associated with land and fertility, and we don't have to dwell too much on the possible trifunctional nature of these female figures. Some scholars are happy to accept the notion of a trio of Machas. Others think that perhaps we should simply focus perhaps on one or two. And it's fair to say that not every legendary female was a goddess of sovereignty. But anyway, this association with horses is particularly significant, as I've said. And this is where we find, I think, important older layers of meaning. One of Cuchulainn's 2 chariot horses was called the Lia Macha, the Grey of Macha. And this may have been one of the twin foals, you remember, that were born at his birth. And this Grey of Macha was a formidable animal. It shed tears of blood before the hero's death, and then, though mortally wounded, came to protect him, so that 50 were slain by his teeth and 30 by each of his hooves. This association between Macha and horses, including the racing of horses at Macha, may be allusions, I think, to equine rituals at Navan, linked to both to the goddess and to the sacral kingship there. Some writers see this Macha as the Irish equivalent of the Welsh Rhiannon and the continental horse goddess Epona. Rhiannon, whose name derives from Rigantona, the great queen, figures in the prose series of tales known as the 4 branches of the Mabinogi. This, the Mabinogion, was written in the late 11th and perhaps then between then and the early 14th centuries. It's very interesting to compare elements of this Welsh tale and the tale we've just recounted in the debility of the Ulsterman. Rhiannon in the Mabinogion appears as another world figure, riding a great white horse, and she's pursued by one Pwyll, Lord of Diffet in South West Wales, who actually also bears the title, interestingly enough, Lord of the Otherworld. He follows her on horseback in the story, and even though she appears to ride at an even, slow pace, he's never able to catch up with her. Her horse is evidently magical. The horsewoman eventually halts, and she indicates that she wishes to be his bride, but tricked into keeping a careless promise, Pwyll is obliged to permit her betrothal to another, who in turn is eventually outwitted and induced to relinquish his claim. And after some time, the union of Pwyll and Rhiannon produces a male child, and on the night of the birth, the boy disappears. Accused of infanticide, this Welsh queen, Rhiannon, is sentenced to spend 7 years at the mounting block outside the court, and she has to offer to carry strangers to the court on her back, like a horse. Tiernan, Lord of Gwent, has a mare that foaled with remarkable regularity every May Day, and every May Day this foal would promptly disappear. On this occasion, coinciding with the boy's birth, however, he prevented a fine, newly born colt from being stolen, and he simultaneously found a child at the door. After 4 years, the colt is given to the child, who has grown prodigiously. Tiernan then recognizes the boy as the son of Pwyll and takes him to the court, where Rhiannon is released from a punishment. Now, this is a convoluted tale, as you can see. It's a complicated narrative, in fact, combining aristocratic lore and folktale motifs, but there are very clear mythic themes embedded here. Like Macha, Rhiannon would seem to have been originally a goddess of sovereignty with equine aspects. It's interesting to sort of summarize the detail. In addition to her magical and horsey qualities, she possesses the principal features of the goddess of sovereignty, who seeks and promotes an acceptable male candidate for kingship. She deliberately chooses Pwyll as her mate, as we saw. She offers him a feast, he achieves wisdom, he consummates his marriage, and after the various difficulties described, he has a son and secures dynastic succession. In addition to this sort of supernatural content, the other threads that connect Macha, wife of Cranach, and Rhiannon are slender but very persuasive. Think about it. In each, there's a horse race with supernatural qualities. There's a contest between a goddess and a king. A birth follows. Twins in the case of Macha. The birth of Pryderi and a colt in the case of Rhiannon. And both are compromised by the careless comments of their respective mates. And most significantly, both of these women undergo a humiliation that blurs the distinction between horse and woman. And here we see some of the mythology that lies behind the Gallo-Roman goddess Epona. Epona now is well known simply in carvings and inscriptions in the Gallo-Roman world, notably in Eastern Gaul and in the Rhineland, and her Celtic origin is not in doubt. And the features that associate her with Macha and Rhiannon are basically remnants of a mythology that must have associated Epona too with equine rituals of some sort. Her name derives from the Indo-European equos, horse, a word we'll come across again. And she's invariably depicted, associated with horses on many inscribed and carved slabs on the continent. And indeed in Britain there are 4 or 5 dedications or representations that include fragments of a stone statuette from Colchester, for example. And indeed there's an inscription on a Roman altar on the Antonine Wall here in Scotland too. I've chosen these 2 particular illustrations from a host of representations of Epona for a very special reason. You can see in each of these, one from Bulgaria and one from Germany, the figure of the goddess is flanked by a number of horses. In these cases, the horses face inwards and face the goddess. But in many other representations, Epona is depicted simply with a horse, a mare, with a mare in a foal, with one horse, or indeed occasionally with groups of horses, as here, facing outwards. Indeed, in one German study of the representations, no less than 7 different types of representation have been sort of noted in the horse and woman configuration here. Basically, I've chosen these illustrations because they offer a clue to something else. Many years ago, the Celtic scholar Garrett Olmsted wrote at some length on the iconography of the very famous Gundestrup cauldron. And he, in the pages of Antiquity, in fact, and elsewhere, suggested that the various illustrations on this very famous piece were actually depictions of a continental version of the great cattle raid, the Toynbee Cúailnge. Nobody that I've ever met thinks this is even remotely likely. He was really speculating, but it was an imaginative piece of work. This particular panel, for example, on the famous cauldron, he suggested betrayed the great Queen Meath. The inward-facing elephants seem to suggest to him that these perhaps represented her warlike nature, elephants representing the power of the military power of Rome. The wheels, he thought, represented the chariot of the great queen, and she made a circuit of her camp at the beginning of the Táin in her chariot. But I think that the fact that this female figure is flanked by elephants is interesting. It might be that we're looking at an illustration of Mistress of Beasts here, but the prominent arrangement of a female flanked by animals, I think, takes us in a very specific direction. In fact, we come across this elsewhere as well. On the very fragmentary Marlborough bucket, you again have the last traces of a head that's generally believed by those who have studied this piece to be female. And here again, on either side of the female head, as you see, there is a horse depicted, in this instance, a horse facing outwards. Now, to come back to the literary evidence, the Ulster hero Fergus Mac Roich, who is a prominent figure in the great cattle raid, is renowned for his remarkable sexual prowess, and he's usually assumed to be the son of Roich, a male figure, his father a great horse. But the scholar Proncius de Cahan has pointed out that while this figure, Roich, the father, is generally taken to be a male, there are several suggestions that actually we should be thinking in terms of the name Roich applying to Fergus's mother. Thus, there are at least 2 instances when Fergus should probably be considered to be the son of the great mare, the Irish equivalent of Epona. And I would like to think that perhaps if the term great mare was a literary epithet for the insular horse goddess, then this may be a further clue to the interpretation of that particular panel on the Gundestrup cauldron. Perhaps continental Celts saw elephants as the ultimate great horse, and perhaps here we have in fact a depiction of the horse goddess, and not Queen Maeve, both on the Gundestrup piece and on the Marlborough bucket. Maeve's, Macha's association with Navan suggests that basically horse rituals were hugely important here. And the excavations of the Navan mound have suggested that time and time again, ritual activity was to the fore. And very briefly, to turn to the archaeological evidence, which I will speed through, I think. When Waterman excavated the great mound, I suspect he thought he would find a passage tomb like the mound of the hostages. But things proved very different here in the great mound at Navan. After removing a mantle of clay from the summit of the mound, he uncovered the surface of a great cairn of stones, as you can see. And this is where any similarity with the Mound of the Hostages rapidly ended, because beneath the cairn of stones, he found this extraordinarily complicated scenario of post holes and palisade trenches that clearly represented a bewilderingly complicated pattern of successive circular structures on the site before the great cairn was actually built. We touched on this in the first lecture. The earliest significant development on the site was the digging of a ditch marked here, and then the digging of a whole series of pits forming a great circle within that ditch. And this happened sometime in the late Bronze Age. And this was the first circular sanctuary on the site. And to use Mircea Eliade's term, this was the exemplary event or gesture that allowed every builder of every subsequent circular structure there, whether mound or enclosure, to be part of that great cyclical recurrence of what had been before, the famous regenerative eternal return. Such important repetitive acts and rituals literally transported the people there into mythical time and time again. An exceptionally complex sequence of circular structures were found here, as you can see. It's actually rather difficult to summarize the sequence in any brief way, but essentially you can see ringed in red there a whole series of circular enclosures more or less built on the same spot, the A, B and C enclosures. These were interpreted as circular houses, basically, and their diameters ranged from 10 to about 13.5 meters. Each of these groups of foundation trenches in the A, B and C enclosures, ringed in red, were constructed in a very peculiar sequence. If you take, for example, the C rings there, the sequence was the middle circle was dug first, and after a period of time, it was replaced by the outer foundation trench. And then after a further period of time, the inner circle replaced the other two. And this happened in the A circles and in the B circles. And it was also recorded in those other circles of attached enclosures to the north. There is a rather bewildering sequence here of repetitive acts on the one spot. You can see that some of those circles on the north had on the right, they're ringed in blue, the remains of avenues approaching the somewhat larger northern enclosures. And not surprisingly, these were interpreted as routeways into a stockade. There was even a third set then of enclosures, the E enclosures, built after this complicated earlier lot. Not surprisingly, also domestic interpretations were advanced, and this was seen as an elite settlement. In one of the C foundation trenches, in fact, the famous skull of a Barbary ape was found. And it's quite natural, I think, to see this as a very prestigious gift. It's the sort of thing that Phoenicians, as you can see, brought with them to ancient Nimrod in the 9th century BC, as this famous piece in the British Museum shows. But I wonder, is prestigious gift underestimating the significance of this? At the palace in Nimrod, these were gifts given to a sacred king. And I wonder if that skull from of a Barbary ape from Navan was perhaps a similar gift to a similar person. And we'll come back to this theme later on. But as I said a moment ago, the various interpretations of this bewilderingly complex sequence of structures led to many publicized accounts of roundhouses with attached cattle kraals or stockades, approached, as I said, by this avenue of parallel palisade trenches. But once again, I think there's abundant evidence now to suggest that any purely domestic function is something that should be simply forgotten. It's not even certain, actually, that all of these structures were roofed here. So time and time again now, the suggestion that we're dealing with ritual enclosures of some sort carries greater and greater weight. And this emphasis on ritual and ceremonial has now gathered momentum because further work at that smaller enclosure within the great enclosure at Navan has demonstrated that once again you had here a series of conjoined enclosures built on the same spot with the same very strange repetitive sequence, middle ring built first, outer ring next, and then inner ring. The sheer size of these, as you can see from the scale there, in excess of 20 meters as far as the larger elements are concerned, seems to indicate that they could never have been roofed. And once again, finds of cremated bone and other discoveries suggest ceremonial activity of a very strange sort here. And I think the most telling indication of the ceremonial nature of these enclosures is what happened next. Because the sort of penultimate event here, as Waterman discovered, was the construction of what he called the great 40-meter structure. And this was a huge building, as the name implies, some 40 meters across, constructed of great concentric rings of timber posts. And there was what he called the ambulatory, this processional way which you see here, leading to a great timber post that formed the center of the 40-meter structure. It was all carefully built to a predetermined radial plan. What was interesting was that it was very clear in the excavations that it had a relatively short life. The great timber post in the center had been felled around 95 BC, judging from dendrodating. But at some point, very quickly thereafter, this shrine, which may or may not have been roofed, was filled with stones. And the vertical timbers, which still stood, including the great central timber, formed voids in the cairn material. And they still survived to quite a distance up into that cairn material, the uppermost levels having disappeared, presumably because of movements in the stone cairn. There was some evidence that these vertical timbers in the great circular structure had borne some sort of weight because they had sunk below their, basal level in the post pits in which they had been placed. And Chris Lynn and Waterman suggested that this great timber structure had been roofed in this fashion, and many published versions of this reconstruction have appeared in print. But once again, I think this is not certain. There may have been a roof, but there could equally well have been perhaps a flat-topped stage on these timbers in some description. In any event, nothing was found within the structure to demonstrate any sort of, domestic activity. So I think, without doubt, we're looking at a great ceremonial shrine here. One, as I said, that had a very short life, and one that was eventually filled with stones. To see it as a shrine to the horse goddess is not, I think, taking a leap too far. And many years ago, Derek Allen published a paper on a series of continental coins that showed horses associated with Gallo-Roman shrines, including one, as you can see on the bottom right there, which shows a horse actually in a shrine. And I wouldn't exclude the possibility at all that the great 40-meter structure, or indeed many of the structures that preceded it, were associated with equine rituals here at Navan, rituals associated with the great mare, the horse goddess. The filling of the shrine with stones to produce the cairn that Waterman uncovered included, as I said, the surrounding of the great central timber post with stones. And as you can see here, it's very clear, once the roof is removed, so to speak, that the great central timber post was the focal element in this extraordinary construction. The surface of the cairn had its own peculiarities, because as you can see from this excavation photograph, when the cairn was uncovered, a whole series of radial lines appeared in the surface of the cairn. And that great central timber post was the focal point in this wheel-shaped device on the summit of the cairn. Chris Lynn has speculated that we might be looking at a great solar symbol here, perhaps associated with a god like the continental Tyrannus, who had a wheel as one of his emblems. But I think there may be another and more interesting explanation for this. However, what sort of rituals took place in the shrine before we leave its interior, so to speak? The historian Charles Doherty has considered some of the rituals that might have been taking place here. And like many writers, he has been drawn to the famous account of the inauguration rite of a Donegal sept, the Kennel Cunnel. And that famous Welsh visitor to Ireland, Giraldus Cambrensis, recorded in the 12th century an oft-quoted account of one of the inauguration rituals associated with the Kennel Cunnel. And of course, he was anxious to display the Irish as barbarians, so he couched it in a very negative fashion, as you can see. But it's worth looking at very closely. He was recording events of times past, but this is an important piece of antiquarian lore, recorded, as I said, in the 12th century. He wrote, "When the whole people of that land had been gathered together in the one place, a white mare is brought forward into the middle of the assembly. He who is to be inaugurated, not as a chief but as a beast, not as a king but as an outlaw, embraces the animal before all, professing himself to be a beast also." And I emphasize this phrase. "The mare is then killed immediately, cut up in pieces and boiled in water. A bath is prepared for the man afterwards in the same water. He sits in the bath surrounded by all his people, and all, he and they, eat of the meat of the mare which is brought to them. He quaffs and drinks of the broth in which he is bathed, not in any cup or using his hand, but just dipping his mouth into it about him. With this unrighteous rite has been carried out, his kingship and dominion has been conferred." And again, I ask you to note the emphasis. It's a peculiar insertion. He professed himself to be a beast also. Many writers have compared this Kennel Cunnel ritual to the Hindu horse sacrifice, the Asvamedha, in which the principal spouse of the king submits to a symbolic union with a dead stallion. The major historical source for this is a 9th century religious tract, but it's very clear that elements are much older, going back well into the 2nd millennium BC. The preparatory ritual in this Indian ritual began with the selection of a stallion that was purified and released in a northeasterly direction. It was allowed to wander for a year, escorted by 100 princes and others, and the return of the horse marked the beginning of the elaborate consecration rituals. The horse was bound to a central stake, and various other animals, including goats and cows, were tied to it. And when the stallion saw mares penned in the sacrificial area, its neighing was interpreted as the recitation of a Vedic verse. It was then attached to a chariot and driven about before being unharnessed and laid on a gold cloth and suffocated, no blood being shed. And at the moment of its death there was the invocation, "You do not die of this, indeed you come to no harm. You go to the gods on easy paths." The chief wife, or the queen, as I say, lay with the dead animal and imitated copulation, while priests and other women present engaged in scabrous dialogue. And finally the horse was dissected. Portions were roasted and offered to the god Prajapati, lord of creation, and then to those present. Now, several writers have noted the obvious inversion here. In India, the ritual involved a stallion and a woman, while the Irish ceremony concerned a king and a mare. But both involved a symbolic union and the killing and dismemberment of a horse. And the purpose was to ensure fertility and prosperity. And it's worth noting too that both rites ended in the consumption of parts of the animal. And in the Indian ritual, other animals were sacrificed too. Only the greatest of Indian kings could perform this ceremony, and as late as the 8th century AD, it was the only touchstone to test the might of a king who deserved to govern the world. Charles Doherty, in fact, has argued that at Navan, this was not the place of inauguration of a local provincial king, but a location associated with the concept of universal kingship. At Navan, a paramount king would, in performing this version of the equine ritual, become basically a Chakravartin in the Indian sense, a world king. And Doherty suggests that the great central post was the axis mundi, because at Navan, as in Vedic India, the world king could only reside in the middle, the zone of the sacred. In India, the world king, the Chakravartin, chakra meaning wheel, was a wheeled turner. Basically, he behaves like the sun, protecting and destroying all creatures with his rays, and he promotes the welfare of his people. Charlie Doherty suggests that at Navan, the clay mound that eventually covered the cairn formed the king's seat, or furra, the same name we came across at Tara. And this was the equivalent of the Indian prasada, the seat of divinity, the home of gods and kings. At Macha, then, the horse sacrifice may have been the culmination of rituals of a sacred marriage, often called by the Greek term hieros gamos, at which the ritual mating with the mythical sovereignty goddess granted the right to rule to a tribal king, who symbolically basically slept with her. It might be added that if this was the case at Macha, the act of mimicking copulation with its horse goddess, the act of mimicking copulation with a mare would have been an especially potent expression of the significance of the sacred marriage there. This, of course, was a contract with the supernatural. Are there any archaeological traces of these sort of rituals, either in Ireland or elsewhere? I think there might be some evidence at Navan, but elsewhere? Well, remember the phrase, professing himself to be a beast. If we turn to some of the continental evidence, there's this very famous wine flagon from a princely grave at Rheinheim in Germany. And the wine flagon has at the top this gilded figure of a horse with a human face. Several writers have described this as a centaur, but a centaur, of course, has arms and a human torso. This is much more than a mythical beast. Miranda Green has proposed that disconcerting images like this human-headed horse, also found on some Gaulish coins, are perhaps expressions of the chaos and dangers of transgressing boundaries. I would prefer to think that perhaps here we're looking at a very potent representation of the phrase, professing himself to be a beast, because it has been suggested that this phrase used by Giraldus Cambrensis might mean that the inaugurant in these Irish rituals may have voiced an actual ritual utterance, such as, I am equos, thou art equa. In other words, I am a horse, you are a horse, which recalls the Vedic marriage formula, I am he, thou art she. And this very unusual combination of horse and human head could be a compelling representation of these equine invocations that were such a momentous part of kingship rites, performed perhaps over a wide area of Europe. Needless to say, the evidence is very scrappy, but it's intriguing to note that this quotation could apply elsewhere. In faraway Bulgaria, there's a very famous wine jug that bears a scene, as you can see, that immediately must recall several of the other images we've been looking at today. there's a figure here of a goddess on this silver jug. And as you can see, she is flanked by pairs of human-headed horses. This is the great hoard from Roscommon, found in 1985. Some people consider this to be a libation vessel with a cultic purpose. And some people have suggested that these are centaurs. They are not centaurs. These are, again, these human-headed horses that I think carry a very different message. To return to Ireland, Doherty has suggested that the concept of the world king is to be found in early Irish poetry. And indeed it is in some of the poems associated with Leinster. There's one brief reference to a king named Bresuel, who is identified with both the whole world and the sun. A brilliant burning flame, a brilliant burning sun, as you see, that heats is the flame Bresuel, fair one of Ireland, descendant of Lorc, who lays waste the world. This association of kingship with solar imagery is unsurprising because we've come across a fair body of archaeological evidence to support the fact that there was a widespread solar cult of some description in Iron Age Ireland. And if rituals of world kingship were one of the motivations for the creation of Navan Mound, then those who carefully built the king's seat there must have been well aware of the ritual precedents that existed. The purpose of the timber shrine and the great wheel shape etched in the surface of the cairn must have been profoundly important symbols. Indeed, the insertion of the great pillar at Navan was probably the most profoundly significant act of all. Because as I said before, the pillar is the focal point of the radial lines carved in the summit of the cairn. These lines are in fact produced by different levels of stones, different arrangements of stones and minor variations in the structure, and they do not descend into the cairn itself. They are simply a very deliberate surface feature. I think here we have at Navan a representation of the axis mundi and the solar wheel. And in the earliest Indian cosmogony reflected in the Rig Veda, the cosmic pillar is the mythical axis of the world, both separating, uniting heaven and earth. And founded in the waters below the earth, this pillar was the channel through which cosmic order was imposed on the world. And when the sun unites with its summit, sun and pillar become a metaphysical unity represented by this wheel above the pillar. This is the wheel pillar that I mentioned a moment ago, and it's a relatively common early Buddhist symbol. And I think this configuration of wheel, pillar, and solar symbol is expressed in the great cairn at Navan in a most extraordinary way. Georges Dumézil would be delighted to see this piece of monumental confirmation of his thesis that perhaps ancient elements of Indo-European beliefs occur at either end of the Indo-European world. It might be worth noting too, by the way, that the great pillar at Navan was set in very wet foundations, which allowed the timber to be preserved for at least portion of its lower part. And votive pillars of this sort in India had to be placed in watery contexts as well. The presence of water was a necessary element for the foundation of votive pillars. Now, while Chris Lynn's suggestion of a link with the Gaulish Tyrannus is not impossible, I think this combination of symbols, like horse sacrifice, represents yet another illustration of the survival of Indo-European beliefs and practices. On a level with the sun and at the axis of the world, the clay-capped summit of the great mount at Navan was an exalted stage for royal ceremonial. And those who stood on top of the mound would have been acutely conscious of what lay beneath the grassy coverage that eventually covered this. Briefly on a Scottish note, I was very intrigued to read that the Belgian scholar Claude Sterckx some years ago suggested that a Scottish legend might contain an echo of the Asvameda practice. You remember that in the Indian scenario, it's recorded that a stallion was allowed to wander for a year before being brought back for the consecration ceremonies and for the sacrifice. Stirk suggested that a Scottish legend that records that in the 14th century, William Thane of Cawdor dreamt that he should place a coffer of gold on the back of a donkey and let it roam freely for a day. And wherever it came to rest after one day was the place to build his castle to ensure his family's prosperity. And the animal lay down under a holly tree that is still preserved, albeit dead, in the castle's dungeon. And there's a lengthy 19th century account of this event. The long dead tree has been dendrodated to 1372, and presumably that's the year it died in the dungeon for lack of sunlight. Now I have to grant you that a wandering ass is perhaps a bit far removed from the purified stallions of Vedic ritual, but it is an intriguing legend, and since so many of these tales only survive in attenuated scraps, I would not rule out the possibility at all that here we have in Scotland the last echo of a ritual associated with kingship inauguration. In any event, at Navan Mound, this wasn't just a place concerned with kingly inauguration. This was a place where the creation of the world was reenacted time and time again. And even though much of the rest of the interior of this great enclosure, and indeed part of the mound, still remains unexplored, on present evidence, this building of the great mound was the last event to take place in this enclosure. And then Macha became, if you like, a focal point in the literary landscape, and its prehistoric kingly associations captured the imaginations of the medieval storytellers in a very different way, and in a major series of tales, of which the famous Táin Bó Cúailnge is just one. It achieved mythic status of another sort, and its pagan rituals were quietly forgotten. In fact, it became an emblem of immemorial royal authority, and the Ulster kings in medieval times employed such titles as King of Amman and King of Ulster. And indeed, in one 12th century panegyric on its Christian kings, parallels are sought with Homeric Troy. Each single man of Awan's territory has a counterpart in tumultuous lordly Troy, according to the medieval scribe. The great prehistoric centre became a mythic centre for heroic deeds and undertakings. It too was eventually superseded by nearby Armagh with its more powerful Christian magic. But in recreating Macha as a royal settlement and the dwelling place of heroes, the medieval scribes, as we've seen, I think, still left us some fleeting glimpses of its horse goddess, the great mare, and the rituals that may have taken place there, the rituals that may have taken place elsewhere, in Scotland and indeed in continental Europe as well. Thank you.